I'll be bringing up Nina Ichikawa from the Berkeley Food Institute, with whom we're co-sponsoring today's event. But just a few brief announcements before we get started with that. We have some really exciting upcoming events and some really important ones. Tomorrow at this time, there'll be a special panel, again, led in part by faculty from Berkeley, on sexual harassment responses to current challenges. A week after that, for our regular noon speaker series, Joanne Spetz from UCSF will be here talking about healthcare workforce shortages and crises, particularly focusing on nurse shortages, which has been a perennial issue here in California. Then for the next couple of talks, we veer into political science. There'll be an update on the Ballot Initiative Reform Act from Mindy Ramiro on May 7th, and then 2 days later on May 9th, a lecture by another distinguished professor. We have one today. We'll have another one on May 9th, Professor Robert Huckfeldt from UC Davis, who will be talking about dueling populists and the political ecology of 2016. So there's a number of other talks throughout the month of May, and then which I'll skip over. They're all on our website, uccs.ucdavis.edu. But on May 30th, there will be a special Capital Insights program at 3 p.m. focusing on the issue of school violence. And we'll have input from a sociologist from UC Santa Barbara, a psychiatrist from UC Davis, and one or more people from the public policy community. So anyway, some good things to look forward to. And for right now, I'd like to bring up Nina Ichikawa from the Berkeley Food Institute.
Thank you, Dr. Kravitz. I'm Nina Ichikawa. I'm the Policy Director at Berkeley Food Institute. We're so pleased to co-sponsor. This is the second of 2 lectures we're sponsoring here at the UC Center, and we're just so grateful to be able to bring Berkeley faculty here. I'll just give you a little background on what we do. We were established in 2014 as a consortium of 7 schools on the Berkeley campus, the colleges of law, public policy, journalism, environmental design, natural resources, and public health and business. I think I got them all. And we now represent around 150 affiliated faculty across those and other schools on campus. So we really try to raise the profile of research and evidence-based policy at the local, state, and federal level. So come see us anytime if you're in the Bay Area. And I'm really pleased to introduce really an amazing expert and star we have on the Berkeley campus. That's Hilary Hoynes. Hilary Hoynes received her undergraduate degree in economics and mathematics from Colby College and went on to get her PhD in economics from Stanford University. Prior to joining the Goldman School of Public Policy at Berkeley, she was a professor of economics at UC Davis. Now she is the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities at UC Berkeley and has a joint appointment in both Public Policy School and our Department of Economics. From 2011 to 2016, she was the co-editor of the leading journal in economics, the American Economic Review. Her current projects, which she'll be talking about today, include evaluating the effects of access to the social safety net in early life on later life health and human capital outcomes, examining the effects of the Great Recession on poverty and the role of safety net in mitigating income losses, and estimating the impact of Head Start on cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes. Her work has been published in leading journals such as the American Economic Review, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy and Econometrica. We're just really grateful because she has just never let up on her absolutely cutting-edge research on SNAP and CalFresh and what that means, both for Californians and in the nation. And it's really an important topic for us to consider now, so I'm so grateful that we have such a smart mind working on it. So with that, welcome, Hilary, and thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. Raise your hands if you're a GSPP alum. Right on. Woo! Sorry, that was a little bit of Cal love there. So I'm really excited to be here. I know this is a lunch talk, and I want to make sure that I leave some time at the end to take some questions. And as usual, I get very excited and cram my talk with probably more slides than is worthwhile to try to fit into 40 minutes, but I'll do my best. So what I want to talk to you about today is some work that I and others have been doing, trying to quantify and articulate the long-run effects of the CalFresh, or nationally SNAP program. And so this is not going to be a talk that is going to be particularly deep into the dive of California, but a little bit more of research from 35,000 feet trying to inform what SNAP does and what kinds of benefits it generates for households. My mic is kind of drooping. In the shorter run and in the longer run. And this research is relatively recent, going on, and it's sort of part of a broader set of studies that folks are working on across the country, which all sort of fit under the category of answering the following question. If we provide more protection through the social safety net to children when they're young, does it make a difference for where they end up in life? That's like the meta question that this research is about. And it's incredibly important for public policy in order to not just quantify the costs of a program and to ask, well, today, how many people are removed from poverty or have better nutrition because of SNAP, which we do, which is great, and that's where I'm going to start my talk. But it's also very important to not sort of end the conversation there, but instead say, well, what difference does it make in the longer run? And it could be that those benefits are quantitatively quite important for our thinking about the grand cost-benefit analysis that one might be thinking about that justifies having a program like SNAP. And so it's sort of challenging because we observe the cost today right in front of us. But the benefits are, A, much harder to measure because we need like statistics and experiments and longitudinal data and all the rest. It's harder to get that. And for a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today, it's about benefits 20 years later. And so it's challenging to think about how to bring that into policy today, but I leave that to you guys. So I crunch the numbers, you guys figure out how to use them. That's the deal. But anyway, so that's sort of where this work fits into a broader research agenda by myself and many other people. But to start out, I'm sure if you're here, you know something about what CalFresh is, or SNAP. It used to be called food stamps. I still slip into using that language. It's an incredibly important anti-poverty program in America and the biggest nutrition program in America. So, it serves about more than 40 million adults and children at a cost of a little under $70 billion in California, serving about 4 million at a cost of a little under $7 billion. The average benefit in CalFresh works out to be something like $4 per person per day. So that's what we're on average distributing to individuals. And what I'm going to come to at the end of the talk, just as sort of to seed some conversation, is the fact that one of the strengths of SNAP is that it has not changed. And unlike many other aspects of our social safety net, most notably cash welfare, or what's called CalWorks in California, really got very dramatically reduced in welfare reform in the 1990s, and food stamps was largely, survived intact through that time period. And the Farm Bill is making its way through. It's out of the committee and in the House, and there's some quite dramatic things in that bill that I want to at least sort of like touch on before the end of the talk. But this is going to be mostly a research talk with some suggestions about why we might be worried about some of the things that might be on the horizon at the end of the talk. So to be eligible for food stamps, your income needs to be below a threshold, net income below the poverty level in America, and benefits, the amount of benefits that a family would get would decrease as their earnings or income increase. Benefits are distributed on debit cards, and you can basically use the benefits on any foodstuffs in grocery stores. So not diapers, but yes to virtually all food in the grocery store. So it's a very unrestricted, kind of very efficient program with very low administrative costs, low error rates, very well run. And it's a federal program, so it's run out of USDA. Virtually the entire cost of SNAP or CalFresh is paid for by the federal government. The administrative costs of the program are what is incurred by the state. So who receives SNAP? You can see that a lot of individuals that receive SNAP are children. And if you look and say, well, what fraction of individuals are either a child, an elderly individual, or a disabled individual, three categories where we would think like maybe society doesn't expect you to work, that adds up to 87% of the national caseload. So you can kind of get a sense of who's on SNAP, what share are workers, what share are non-workers. They're mostly workers if they're not children, elderly, or disabled, who typically aren't workers. So a lot of children. If we kind of compare some of those numbers for California compared to the national numbers, you can see that in California, we have a bit more than average of our caseload as children, are in families with children, I should say. That 74% is the percent of families with, percent of families on SNAP that have children in them, is the right way to say that. And you can see how the other numbers line up. California also has a bit more than the national average are working families. And you can see that reflecting the income eligibility criteria in CalFresh, it goes to low-income families. Kind of by definition, that has to be true. And you can see that, about a non-trivial share of recipients are earning what we call extreme poverty, which is income below 50% of poverty. So it's a very targeted benefit on quite low-income individuals in the United States. So the three kinds of things that I want to talk about, and most of my time is going to be on number 2, is to start out by just reminding everybody sort of what SNAP does that we normally talk about. It's the biggest, one of the biggest anti-poverty programs in America, and I want to just show you those numbers. And then I want to spend most of my time describing some of this recent research that I've been working on that tries to quantify the long-run effects of the food stamp program, and then we'll come back to the kind of current policy issues. So I want to just quickly go over 4 what I would just call kind of facts or features about CalFresh or SNAP. And before I do that, a lot of people, it's a food and nutrition program. So as a first order effect, the point of SNAP is to try to improve nutrition in households. The benefits of SNAP, like I said, are quite unrestricted. You can sort of buy anything in the grocery store. And, we all buy food. We all need food. And the size of the benefit for virtually all recipient families doesn't even pay all the groceries that they demand. So as an economist, I would say that money is rather fungible. So even though it's something that is distributed towards food benefits, because the demand for food is there for everybody, we're essentially just kind of paying something you'd already have to pay, which frees up your resources to do whatever is best for the family to do with it. The point of kind of mentioning that is to say that it's more than a nutrition program. It's really an income assistance program. And it is the critical kind of universal safety net in America. And so that's the first set of things that I want to, I'm a safety net scholar. That's what I do. And I think a lot of times we forget that SNAP is more than a nutrition program. It's a safety net program, which is even bigger in my mind. So 4 things. 1, just show you some data that SNAP is one of the biggest anti-poverty programs in America. It's the closest thing to a universal safety net that we have for low-income families in America. It plays a very important automatic stabilizer role in downturns. Kind of macroeconomic language, basically saying that, in recessions, incomes go down, and SNAP is one of the critical partner of unemployment assistance that helps protect families in downturns, and we saw that in the Great Recession, and it also helps just like increase aggregate demand, which helps us get out of recessions. That's what an automatic stabilizer is. And as wages for low-skilled workers in America are declining through global forces and all the rest, SNAP is more and more important as a wage supplementation program rather than what many people have in their mind as sort of a welfare program for people who aren't working. So it really is becoming, particularly for families with children, a wage supplementation program because of those declines in wages. So the data on poverty, this just tabulates child poverty, the number of children that are poor in America, and it takes each one of our main social safety net programs and said, suppose we just zeroed that out. How many more children would be poor? And so the biggest anti-poverty program in America for children is the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. But the Earned Income Tax Credit is a bigger part of this. And number 2 is SNAP or CalFresh. These are national numbers. And you can see how other elements of the social safety net compare. Way down the list is cash assistance through what is called nationally TANF, or what's called CalWorks in California. So a lot more children are raised out of poverty by CalFresh than by CalWorks, because CalFresh is a much bigger program and touches a lot more people. If we look inside California, and sorry, this is would be better if this was a map, but this is what I was able to grab last night. The number is that CalFresh removes 800,000 people from poverty in California, and this table, which comes from PPIC, kind of gives you an idea of how that's distributed across counties, and it breaks it out between children and adults. So in my home county of Alameda, CalFresh removes 16,000 adults from poverty and 11,000 children from poverty. So you can, PPIC has a nice report that you can grab these numbers from. Another kind of reflecting the kind of universal nature of SNAP, you can see that this is a figure from the Urban Institute that goes back. I'm kind of back and forth between the national numbers and the state numbers. This is back to the national. It basically shows you now the percent, looking at the left, the percent reduction in poverty rates by these different groups. And the point of this is not necessarily to study each one of these groups right here and now, but to show you that the reductions in poverty rates are true for children, for adults, for elderly, across different race and ethnicity groups, across different kinds of families. So it's a program that reaches a very wide cross-section of Americans because of its universal feature. And so then you see these kind of benefits of reducing poverty rates, like literally across the board. So it's extremely important sort of leg of our stool of basic kind of income protection for Americans. And that's a piece that a lot of people don't really think about it that way. So this is like above and beyond thinking of the reality of on the ground and nutrition, and like the dollars coming into the household make a huge difference for people's poverty status, which is the marker, a marker. So what do I mean by universal safety net? It turns out that most of our income-based safety net in the United States is targeted at certain kinds of Americans. So traditionally, our assistance has been in America is basically targeted on children, disabled individuals, and seniors. And there's a lot of people that don't fit into those three buckets. And food stamps, kind of from its beginning, was designed as being kind of like Social Security for the elderly. Food stamps is the one thing that sort of reaches most people, with some very important groups that are not, that are left out. The most importantly is people based on different immigrant statuses have different access to food stamps, and there's restrictions on how long you can receive food stamps and other kinds of restrictions if you're, and this is not my language, this is the language of the regulation, if you're able-bodied recipients without dependents. So think of an adult that is without kids and is not disabled. There's more restrictions on access. So it's not perfect, but relative to the rest of our social safety net, it's quite widespread. And it's an entitlement, which means that when demand goes up because there's a recession, you don't reach the end of a block grant that says, nope, sorry, we've given out all the resources we have. So CalWORKs, cash assistance, is block granted. So there's a limit. Food stamps is an entitlement. And what we know is that's really, really important for preserving all the things that it can do. So I kind of already said this. I just used that word. SNAP is an entitlement, not a block grant. So it quickly adjusts when need adjusts. And one way to see this is to look at what happened in California. And so the blue bars is how much we spent on CalFresh in California year by year. And you can sort of see the recession period where we know unemployment rates went up, and jobs went down in California. You see the CalFresh spending follow that. So CalFresh is an extremely cyclical program that moves with the market. So when there's more jobs and higher wages, there's less CalFresh spending. When there's less jobs and lower wages, there's more CalFresh spending. And that is what a safety net should do. That's like top of the list of a job of a safety net. When times are bad, it kicks in. And this is just kind of a way of illustrating that. And now that we're sort of coming out of the recession, I mean, some parts of the state are thriving and other parts are still struggling. You see the CalFresh spending starting to come down. So it's a really important kind of what we call counter-cyclical measure that kicks in when employment is lost. So the last feature that's just important to remember is that if you're a low-skilled worker in America, times are not great. And so just one way of showing this, there's many different graphs I could show you to make this point, and this graph goes all the way back to 1964, before many of you in this room were born. But the point is to show you that take somebody with a high school education and no more, I think that's the red line. This tracking relative wages in real terms for men on the left and women on the right. If you follow this red line, particularly for men, it's less striking for women, less depressing for women, you'll see that, this red line has basically stayed flat for men since the early 1990s and peaked in the mid to early 70s. So in real terms, wages for low-skilled workers are not keeping up with prices. That's what that shows. It's a little bit less dramatically negative for women, but nonetheless, you see a lack of a lot of wage growth for low-skilled workers. And that pressure, I'm a low-skilled worker working full-time. There's the same Hillary Hoynes doing that in 2018, and there's another version of me doing that 30 years ago. It's a lot harder to make ends meet in this time. So with that pressure of decreases in wages, this is where CalFresh becomes this wage supplementation program to top up families' earnings to help them make ends meet. And then the other piece, just stepping back and just kind of filling it out, the other piece that's really important for that is the earned income tax credit. That is a straight-up kind of wage subsidy that operates as a tax refund through the tax system. And as I'm sure everybody knows, now California has the Cal EITC that's in its second year that's really important. And so these are the features that kind of help to mitigate the sort of global pressures that low-skilled workers face in the United States. So with that sort of backdrop, I want to talk to you about some of this work that I've been doing. But before talking about the long run, what else do we know about what SNAP does? So the result that's very robust and dramatic, that shows up with all sorts of different research designs that we use to try to evaluate what SNAP does. It turns out, just putting on my methodologist hat, it's really hard to evaluate what SNAP does for the reasons I just talked about. It's a universal program. It hasn't changed a lot over time. So in order to ask the question, what does SNAP do? How does it make people better off? You need to kind of say, well, who's the control group here? And in a nutshell, it's hard to find control groups for SNAP because it's a universal program. And people who are on SNAP are struggling. And so if you just compare SNAP recipients to non-recipients, SNAP recipients are going to look worse. But that's not a very good control group. And so the research is really challenged with finding a good control group to make compelling evaluation. And so I'm not going to spend our short time together talking to you about all the ways we do that, but there's all sorts of tricks we use, or I shouldn't call them tricks, tools in our tool bag that we use to try to do evaluation in this context. And what you find, regardless of how you do it, is that SNAP reduces food insecurity. It's a very powerful result. It is true for children. It is true for adults. It is true for the college students that are now starting to get access to SNAP. SNAP reduces food insecurity. And we know from other research that food insecurity leads to important challenges in learning and other sorts of important lifelong costs that generate from food insecurity. We also know that the magnitude of the food stamp benefit doesn't get most households through the month. And so there's this very compelling research that shows that you get your food stamp benefit, let's say on the 10th of the month. You follow households through that monthly cycle, and you see by the end of the month, from calorie intake and nutritional surveys, you see people eating less. You see the children more likely to be going to school without breakfast. You see disciplinary actions at schools going up. So you see more people showing up at the hospital with some hypoglycemia-related intakes to the hospital. So there's this whole sort of suite of results that even sort of show within the month there's this kind of inadequacy of SNAP, and then that translates into adverse outcomes. So the upside is reduces food insecurity. The concern is that maybe our benefit level isn't adequate and that there's challenges in having it last. Those are the key things that we know about that are kind of about health and things that we don't automatically think about when we talk about SNAP and nutrition. But next, I want to talk about this work that I've been doing that looks at this question of the longer run. And so the question is, the experiment that I want to run is I give more food stamps to one set of children, and the other set of children doesn't get it. I mean, I wouldn't do this, but let's just theoretically. And then we let 20 years go by, and then we see where those kids are at. Now, I don't have that experiment to give you results on, but what we have is what we economists trickily call a quasi-experiment that we use to try to mimic that sort of a approach. And so what we do is we take advantage of the fact that, I'll come back to that, I promise, that when food stamps was first introduced in America, which was basically between the 1960s and the 1970s, the middle of the 60s to the middle of the 70s, for very interesting bureaucratic reasons, it did not go everywhere at one time. So the food stamp program was effectively rolled out across American counties, and depending on when you were born and where you were born, if you may or may not have had access to food stamps. And while you might not inherently be interested in the 1960s or 1970s, the reality is if you want to evaluate the long-run effects of something, unfortunately, you have to go back in time. So I can't tell you about the long-run effects of a policy that starts today. I need to wait 20 years to get there. So it's just kind of a reality that you need to go back in time to evaluate the long run. And this turns out to be one way that we try to figure out what does food stamps do in the face of it being a universalist program. We leverage the fact that some counties in America, for awesome random reasons, awesome from the standpoint of doing evaluation, that it's random. Some counties got food stamps 10 years before other counties. And so what we do is we can observe in our data where people were born and when they were born, and we use that to effectively create like treatment and control groups that then compare where people are today and relate that to their what we call exposure to food stamps in childhood. So I'm going to show you some graphs from that work, but that's the basic idea. Leverage this variation, observe people today, knowing where they were born and when they were born, in order to describe what they had available to them and to try to relate that statistically to their education, earnings, and health in adulthood. So that's the plan. And just to kind of, you might say, well, why would we think that changing food in childhood would lead to differences in education in adulthood? And there's a lot of different pathways. At this point, I cannot tell you what the pathway is. Science usually starts by first establishing a fact, and then you try to figure out the pathways second. So we don't have the pathways nailed. But there's one important, there's a lot of evidence that like 0 to 3 really important years. We talk about that with, early childhood education and brain and all the rest. Well, it turns out that there's sort of a nutritional parallel to that. And it's often called the fetal origins hypothesis. So this hypothesis was advanced by an epidemiologist named Barker. And the basic idea that has been very well established in experiments with rats, that's cool, but I don't know how much it tells us about people, and has also been replicated in some epidemiology kinds of studies, is that when moms are pregnant, and also, at least in rats, in early life of the rat, if the mom has less nutrition when they're pregnant, or postnatally the baby has less nutrition, your metabolic system is developing at that time, and the metabolic system, it's aimed to survive. And so the metabolic system, as it's developing, says, oh boy, I'm not getting a lot of calories, so I'm going to be very efficient. This is my technical, like trying to explain science as an economist. So the metabolic system adapts and develops in the face of less nutrition. But then what happens is, if you survive and then are out in the world and just normal life and you're not in a famine, that's where a lot of the original research happened, was in that study of famines. What happens is your metabolic system is set for an efficient world, and it doesn't change. Once it's set, it's hard. It doesn't adjust back. And the implication of that is when you get older, post-reproductive age, they say, you have a higher risk of metabolic syndrome from this overloading of your metabolic system, which manifests itself in obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, that like suite of things, which, P.S., very expensive conditions to treat. So the theory then would say that providing more food stamps in childhood and in utero, if thinking from the perspective of the mom, could lead to a reduction in metabolic syndrome in adulthood. And that would sort of come from this Barker hypothesis, fetal origins hypothesis. And this has been very well documented in the context of severe famines, but there hasn't been as much work to look at more, ordinary fluctuations like we're looking at. So that's one pathway, is this very much kind of a nutrition pathway. But, you could imagine how, having better nutrition in school leads to children learning better, which could have another pathway. And other sorts of things that we'll figure out over time. But the bottom line is, I'm going to show you some work that first looks at metabolic syndrome and how that in adulthood is changed by having access to food stamps. And then I'm going to show you some evidence on more human capital outcomes and a few other things. But they're all within this context of longer term evaluation, and they all have to do with this county leveraging this county rollout. I think what I'm going to do is just show you the picture and talk you through it. and then we'll have time to show you some of the other results. So these are estimates from our statistical model that does this kind of treatment control thing. And what we do is, on the horizontal axis is a marker of how old you were, and I say you, like we've got a data sample with thousands of people in it that are born over many different decades, and I know where they were born. And so I can go to the food stamp rollout data and say, aha, you know, Hillary Hoynes was born in X county and Y year. She was 10 years old when food stamps was introduced in her county. But then I've got someone else in my data who, given their age and where they were born, food stamps came on at a different age. And so the blue line here plots out our estimates of what your metabolic syndrome outcome was relative to kind of the mean in the population. And everything here is in standard deviation units. So minus 0.3 would be a reduction of 0.3 standard deviations relative to the mean in the population. For what? For metabolic syndrome. And in particular, we take these 5 things that we can observe in our data, and people are like in their 40s and 50s now in our data that were, you know, born in these cohorts around this time period. So we have obesity, whether, you know, what your obesity status is, whether you have high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, heart attack. For each one of those variables, we just minus the mean and divide by the standard deviation and then average over the 5 of those. Those are details you don't really need to know, but it's basically an index of the 5 elements, and then the results are just presented in standard deviation units. So let's just call it metabolic syndrome. That's what we label it here. And so what this then plots out is, sorry, this is a long windup. Like, you can be looking at this and go, oh my God, this graph is amazing. Look what it shows food stamp does, but I just got to walk you there. So all of these dots are relative to, it always has to be relative to something. So it's relative to what if food stamps was rolled out when you were 10. And so that's 0. Like, I literally made this 0, so everything is relative to that. So as we move in this direction on the x-axis, we're using our data to say, compared to food stamps coming online when you were 10, what if food stamps came online when you were 4 or 5? Answer, it doesn't change your metabolic syndrome very much at all. Okay, so it's kind of a flat line here. But starting at around age 4 or 5, as we move to answering like the experiment, well, what if food stamps was introduced when you were 2 or 1, or when your mom was pregnant, or before? What happens? There's this remarkably linear relationship, what we sometimes use in the medical literature, like a dose response. Like, the more you get, the better the outcome. Because as we're moving in this direction, you're getting more years of food stamps. Because once it comes, it doesn't go away. So if you have food stamps in your entire lifetime, then your metabolic syndrome outcome is about 0.35 standard deviations lower than someone who got food stamps at age 10. So the punchline of this is that having access to food stamps, particularly in early life, reduces the incidence of metabolic syndrome in adulthood. Okay, you're ready to have that like blow your mind now. Now you can go, wow, that is so cool. I mean, like, we did not know this before. No one thought to even look at something like this before. And it sort of fits into this like Barker hypothesis, fetal origins, like maybe early life is a particularly important time for this metabolic syndrome kinds of risks. And so improving nutrition in those early years is particularly important. Way out here, like, what does it mean for food stamps to come in a negative age? Well, it means it was in place before you were born. And the fact that this is flat, we really like. Because it shouldn't matter whether food stamps was in place 3 years before you were born or 1 year before you were born. It's before you were born. And so the fact that this is flat gives us more credibility. We call this like a placebo trend. And the fact that there's no evidence of more SNAP doing anything makes us more confident that this is actually SNAP rather than something else. So I'm now going to show you some other graphs that are just like this, but with different outcomes. So I don't have to go through the whole descriptor. But the punchline is the long-run effect of SNAP, particularly with exposure in early life, means you're healthier in adulthood. So some more recent work that we've been doing to focus on human capital outcomes is the health outcomes, we had to use a relatively small data set because that's where we could measure these health outcomes. For measuring human capital outcomes, we can use a much bigger data set. So we're using the 2000 census, the 1 in 5 sample of the 2000 census with many millions of observations, matched with the Social Security Administration to get people's exact dates of birth and place of birth so we can do this food stamp assignment thing. And so this is what we're finding. This is the same kind of graph, except there's more points on there compared to the other one because our data is bigger, so we can just estimate more points. But the picture is the same, constructed in the same way. You start with the age 10 being 0, and you move in this direction, and it's more food stamp exposure. And here the outcome is, what is your human capital? It's a combination of your educational attainment, all the information we have about education, your occupation, in your adulthood that we observe. And you see the same pattern. The more food stamps, metabolic syndrome was a bad thing, so food stamps pushed it down. Education is a good thing, food stamps pushes it up. So more food stamps in childhood, particularly maybe, it's kind of throughout, not concentrated way at the youngest ages, but steeper at the youngest ages. More food stamps means more education. And these are also in standard deviation units. They're not as big as the health outcomes, but they're still kind of important findings about better access to resources in early childhood means better education in adulthood. We are also finding evidence because we can merge this to the Social Security records that tracks deaths. And so we're also finding that it reduces mortality, although this is a pretty young sample, so there's probably a lot more to learn as these guys age. So again, more access to food stamps, and the outcome here is, do you survive until the last year we observe you in the Social Security data, which is 2012. So the food stamps increases the risk that you survive. That's a good thing. So more food stamps means lower risk of metabolic syndrome in adulthood, better health, better human capital, and better health is measured by survival. And something that's really compelling to me is the results that we have for, it turns out in the census you can observe incarceration. And what we're finding is that, and this is only for non-white males, that more access to food stamps means a lower risk of being incarcerated. The outcome here is not incarcerated, so going up is a good outcome. And as you can see, unlike any of the other graphs I show you, it's like all the way through childhood. More food stamps means a lower risk of being incarcerated in adulthood. And this is only found for the subgroup of non-white males. So the punchline from this work is that more access to food stamps means better outcomes in adulthood, and those outcomes seem to be both in the sort of economic sphere as well as in the health sphere. And these kinds of 20 years later is the kind of research that is going on across the United States by scholars studying what Medi-Cal does, what CalWORKS does, what I'm talking to you today is what SNAP does or CalFresh does. So I'm not gonna. I want to make sure I have time for your questions, and I'm almost there. But many elements of our social safety net are threatened right now by restrictions that some folks are talking about in Washington. And one of the key things that shows up in this farm bill, which is what funds the CalFresh or SNAP program, is really a desire to try to make, the way I think about it is, to make SNAP more like CalWORKS. So more restrictions about work requirements and more sanctions. In other words, you can't get CalFresh, that's what a sanction is, if you don't comply with those rules. And so that is a really core feature of what has currently come out of the Ag Committee in the House for the Farm Bill, which funds CalFresh. And so this, I think, is something to be really concerned about. These are the numbers about the estimated effects on California for what CBO, that's not in this site, but that CBO has tabulated the adverse effects of these changes to SNAP were implemented nationwide. So I think there are things that we want to be concerned about, and I'll just end with one graph that I think well encapsulates how implementing these kinds of work restrictions can lead to less effectiveness of a program. So this graph here shows, on the eve of welfare reform in the United States, 68 out of every 100 families with children that were poor received cash assistance. And today, that number is 23. Because of that, what was a kind of erosion of the social safety net, the cash social safety net, which California, it looks better, as California is the state that preserved the most that it could, I think, or, well, I don't know, we could have a debate about that, but more than other states. And so I think that this is the concern. The concern is the more restrictions you put on the program, the more people are going to have trouble staying compliant, and the decline in the efficacy of the program reaching who needs it. So I would be happy to take any questions that you have in the time we have left.